Hello at Malapotkin on Twitter. I'm sorry this took so long to get to you. I initially thought, I'll just respond with like a tweet thread, and then I started writing that, and I thought, you know what? I think I'll make a video of this and just post that to him, and I thought I could, go off the dome and make it in 30 minutes. And then, life got in the way, and it just didn't happen till now. But I'm still basically going off of the dome. For those of you who aren't at Malapotkin on Twitter, if there are any of you, I'm just going to ramble my thoughts on Murray Rothbard. The short little, perhaps calling it a story would be too generous, but the short version of this not story is I posted on Twitter 4 books that started me on my current intellectual journey, no matter how cringe. And one of them was by Murray Rothbard, and at Malapotkin asked me just what my thoughts on Rothbard were. I told him I'd get back to him after work, and I never did. Woe is me. Anywho, so here's my... Malapotkin has also told me that he's a communist and not super familiar with Rothbard in general, so I don't know what his level of Rothbard knowledge is. So I'm going to start with my personal exposure to Rothbard, then I'm going to give the good, then I'm going to give the bad. Okay, so here's my personal Murray Rothbard sort of story. When I was a kid, before high school and in high school, I had become a libertarian. I grew up in a conservative household, listened to a lot of conservative radio, and the rhetoric they used was this sort of rhetoric of freedom from oppression and tyranny and of small limited government. And so the first time I heard one of these conservative talking heads say they were opposed to marijuana being legal, I was like, what? Wait, that doesn't make any sense at all. That goes against all of your previous rhetoric. Why? That's entirely inconsistent. And so my initial becoming a libertarian was entirely motivated from a desire to be consistent with these other views that I initially held on the basis of, being exposed to them and taught them, which is what I think happens with a lot of people. And so I started reading classical liberals. In particular, Frederick Bastiat's The Law is one of the things I would credit, and John Locke's Second Treatise on Civil Government, which I think I read the year before I started high school. And I think I read a tiny bit of Rothbard. Nothing where he reveals that he's an anarchist, but maybe a scribble here or there that I came across online. And I began to wonder to myself, can I actually justify the existence of the government or the nation state as a way to protect people's rights? Like, I believed people had rights, but it seemed to me like the nation state, through taxes, involved violating rights that I thought people actually had. But I couldn't accept that. I thought, well, there's got to be some sort of a philosophical justification that I would be able to accept that isn't some sort of utilitarianism or some sort of theory that's just about maximizing people's rights not being violated, right? Because if you have a theory where you just maximize people's rights not being violated, it's okay to violate people's rights as long as it decreases total rights violations. That seems odd because it seems like there are still certain things you just shouldn't do. And so I was wondering what the philosophical justification for the state could possibly be. And then I read Rothbard. In particular, I read not Anatomy of the State, but actually Man, Economy, and State and Power and Market first, which convinced me that, perhaps we could function without nation states, without governments. Perhaps we could have the enforcement of rights sans these institutions that necessarily involve violating rights. I wasn't entirely convinced by him. It took also reading Morrison Tannehill's The Market for Liberty, The Machinery of Freedom by David Friedman, and Molinari's essay, like a contemporary of Bastiat, who I'm blanking on the name of the essay. But yeah, that's essentially what convinced me that nation states were almost certainly not justified. Now, I still tried to get out of it. I was very invested in not believing that, in thinking that, well, this is a crazy, insane view. It's got to take a lot of evidence to talk me out of this, believing that a state should exist. And so I kept looking for a way to justify it. And then eventually, when I failed to find it and was convinced by Rothbard and Friedman that it wasn't the end of the world, there wouldn't be a nuclear holocaust, things like just existing with institutions other than nation states to enforce laws is not necessarily a dystopia. It could be. A lot depends on contingencies and how people expect society to function. But I was convinced by Rothbard that it was feasible. Okay, so that's sort of my personal experience with him and why I like him. So now let me try to be more objective about it and talk about the good things about Rothbard and the bad things about Rothbard. So let's start off with the good. A lot of economists and political philosophers dismiss Rothbard out of hand. Right? I think the general consensus on Rothbard from most political philosophers, most economists, is that he continued to operate in a defunct tradition and defended it somewhat ineptly. I think that's probably the general view most people would have of him. Or might be something like he was a fundamentalist almost about applying libertarianism and didn't defend that particularly well. If you're going to dismiss him as being... So I'm going to get into the bad later. I don't want to get too much into the bad now. I do think that's unfair. And I think that's unfair for a number of reasons. So Rothbard is something of a polymath. He really was very, very brilliant. He knew a ton of stuff across a ton of diverse fields and wrote and published a ton of stuff in a ton of diverse fields. While he was an economist by training, he wrote a lot about history. That's probably his best stuff. His political philosophy and political theory stuff was never taken super, super seriously, except by other people who are libertarians. Rothbard almost functions better as a critique of traditional classical liberalism, right? He almost functions as an argument ad absurdum, where I think he successfully establishes that if you're going to be consistent with classical liberalism and be consistent with thinking property rights are a right, you can't justify the existence of nation states because they necessarily violate those rights, not just in terms of taxes, although that's probably his biggest bugaboo, but also in terms of setting themselves up as a monopoly, right? If someone else is going to come in and they're going to justly enforce rights, right? Let's say someone comes in and starts some sort of community organization, crowd sourcing thing, where objectively speaking, they catch more bad guys with more accuracy, less false arrests, less violation of people's rights than the nation state. The nation state would still stop them from operating. Right? They'd still say, well, we're the monopoly on on legitimate use of force, so you can't operate. And so Rothbard would say, well, that's clearly, if government has any right to enforce rights and use force, well, it seems like whatever right that is would come from individual folks who already have that right in and of themselves. So he'd go back to people like Lysander Spooner and argue, well, if people didn't give up that right, they still obviously must have it. That sort of a thing. So Rothbard, his biggest, we're getting a little bit out of the order I want to go in, but I want to point out that among other libertarians, even libertarians who are big and super respected by the mainstream, this is something they have to reckon with. They either have to accept Rothbard and bite the bullet and say, yes, I reject the legitimacy of nation states. I think society would be better off without them, and I think they're inherently unjust. Or they have to come up with a convoluted way around it, right? So Robert Nozick, who everybody is going to respect, right? Whether you're a communist, whether you're a conservative, whether you're progressive, whether you're classical, whatever you are, Nozick, unlike Rothbard, is obviously and clearly a respected philosopher, and in the realm of political philosophy, but also in the realm of things like epistemology. Nozick, unlike Rothbard, is not going to be as controversial in terms of his impact. And what is Nozick's view on Rothbard? Nozick's view on Rothbard is that Rothbard is a serious enough threat to the sort of classical liberalism and minarchism that Nozick wants to affirm, that Nozick spends the entire first part, not chapter, chunk of Anarchy, State, and Utopia dealing with Rothbard. It's not until Nozick gets Rothbard out of the way that he goes on to deal with John Rawls and more leftist views, right? That's how important it is. He thinks Rothbard has leveled a devastating, almost, critique of the state, and Nozick is going to need to go back and defend Locke against these sort of Rothbardian arguments. Now, when I was a kid, and I desperately wanted to not have to be an anarchist, I got Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And I will admit 100%, as a high school sophomore, it really went over my head. I didn't understand Nozick's argument. I thought, like a lot of people, that his argument was just, well, it's inevitable that a monopoly will form just for practical reasons. And that didn't satisfy me because I was looking for ethical reasons why such a monopoly was justified. And then as I got older, and when I reread the book, I realized that point in his argument is not where it stops. Now, that point isn't... I actually think Nozick can get his argument off the ground without needing that. But Nozick thinks that he needs it. He thinks it's an important part of his argument. But it certainly is not where he stops. He doesn't cite Rothbard as much in the text itself. He doesn't say Rothbard says such and such. He cites Rothbard constantly in the footnotes in that first section. So part of my evidence for Rothbard being important is that Robert Nozick thinks Rothbard is important enough to address and deal with. And he doesn't deal with him as conclusively and spends a lot more time dismantling his position than he does with Rawls, in my personal opinion. With Rawls, Nozick has a number of good arguments to sort of cut down Rawls, in my opinion. But with Rothbard, it's sort of this one long, sustained, complicated argument that if you can take out a piece of it, it probably fails and Rothbard is probably still correct. So Nozick wants to affirm a bunch of Rothbard, but then abandon the anarchism. And so he has this very careful part of Anarchy, State, and Utopia doing that, and largely fails. And I'm sorry, Malapatkin, for going so long into that. But that's my evidence that Rothbard is actually important. He's probably going to be more important to libertarians. But if you're a libertarian, you have to reckon with Rothbard and whether or not you're going to be an anarchist or whether or not you're going to find a way out of being an anarchist if you want to affirm some sort of property rights-based motivation for libertarianism. You're going to have to grapple with Rothbard in one way or another. Okay, so that's my evidence for Rothbard being important, academically speaking. But beyond that, he's clearly super important for the development of libertarianism as a movement in the United States. The running joke for a long time was every libertarian knows Murray Rothbard personally in the United States. This was when the movement was a lot smaller, and Rothbard started the Libertarian Party of New York, and believe the National Libertarian Party. Please don't quote me on that. Need to do more research. He was there at the founding of the Cato Institute, Mises Institute. Like, he got kicked out of a lot of that stuff later on, and we'll talk about that when we talk about some of the bad. But he's also clearly important for, like, the growth of the political movement. He's an important popularizer of the ideas, right? He initially wrote in National Review, then he wrote in more leftist publications, and then he's written in a lot of stuff, and a lot of people have read him. And a lot of people who were initially conservatives ended up moving over to libertarianism specifically because of Rothbard. And we're going to argue later that he tried to do the same thing with the left earlier on, and I'm sure some people on the left became libertarians because of him, but it certainly wasn't as big of a thing. Okay, so he's a polymath, knows a bunch of stuff. Oh, he's also just a fantastic writer. Like, if you read his stuff, he plays hardball and hits hard, but it just reads wonderfully, joyfully. His exuberance and happiness shows through. He's consistent in his views and persistent on them. He doesn't give up much. He sticks to his guns. We're going to talk about how that can be bad later, like both practically, because sometimes when he should compromise in order to, make alliances, or he should compromise in order to do certain things, he doesn't. And sometimes he, will stick to his guns and bite bullets and, like, accept crazy out there stuff that he shouldn't. And I think he was right to accept the anarchism part, but there are other things that he bites bullets on that are just nuts. But yeah, he's important. Like, objectively speaking, for the American political landscape today, he's important because libertarianism, not at the party, but the influence on the Republican Party, and I think in a positive direction. I think the libertarian influence on Republicans has been like their one saving grace, and besides that, they're evil, horrible people. But he's important for what has happened in American politics. Okay, so let's talk more about what he believes and what's good in that. So, me personally, being an economist, the first things I'm going to try to find that I like in Rothbard are his economic stuff. And being someone who is sympathetic to the Austrian school, right, Menger, Bombavrik, and Mises, I like Rothbard for being a defender of their views. Now, he doesn't contribute much original, and his exposition of their views is good for popularizing it, but there's not much new. What Rothbard probably brings most to the table when it comes to economics is his defense of the sort of epistemology of economics he wants to support, and a particular sort of methodology for doing economics, which I think is very, very important. And I think he does a good job explaining what that methodology is and defending how it can be useful. And essentially the methodology is you start with introspection about what it means to act and do things, and then from a particular theory of that you try to deduce economic laws and rules, and we can make another video some other time, but this sounds at first like it might be a fool's errand. I'm convinced that it's much more fruitful than you might otherwise think. And I'm also convinced that mainstream economists, whether they know they're using this method or not, are actually using it. And they're going and looking for empirical evidence for ideas they came up with through what Rothbard and Mises would call the praxeological method. This is also a bad thing, because he's also too forceful on this, and he makes claims he can't back up. And he's so forceful on it that in some ways he's going to make Austrian economics look more fringe than it should be, because of some of the strong statements and claims he makes about the uselessness of other tools for doing economics. So, yeah, some good, some bad. We'll talk more about the bad in a bit. Another good thing in what he writes is he always presents the government and the state as serving the powerful, right? If you read Man, Economy, and State and Power and Market, once he talks about how particular government action distorts things, and the negative effects he has, he almost always points out, and pay attention here to how this benefits the rich and harms the poor. And that is a running theme throughout his work that I think is underappreciated, but is clearly there. He likes to make a point of how government intervention tends to be designed specifically to benefit those who are already well off and already powerful, because they're the ones who have the ability to access and design what government policy is. And it tends to be at the expense of people who are less well off. I like the fact that he applies his theory of property rights with a sense of clarity. So, like, what he has to say about pollution, for example, is basically pollution boils down to property rights. And if you apply property rights consistently, you have... Rothbard actually has extremely strong anti-pollution views, because he thinks if someone lives in a certain place and a company comes along and starts polluting, even if that person was just a small guy and that company is making stuff that's helping a lot of people, that small little guy who was there first, whose water or air is being polluted, has the right to get the company to stop, because the company is violating his rights that he already homesteaded. Rothbard is extremely anti-pollution. He doesn't have a great way to deal with sort of global warming or worldwide pollution or carbon dioxide and stuff, but he takes these ideas about property rights and how they work and applies them very rigorously, very clearly, and very consistently. Same thing with immigration, where he says very early on that restrictions on people immigrating are just property rights restrictions. They're telling someone who rents out property, you can only rent out property to these specific people we enumerate. You can't rent it out to someone from a foreign country. Or if you are an employer and you want to hire someone, you can only hire the specific people the state tells you to. He views it as a restriction on their rights and the rights of the people they're bargaining with to come to an agreement, and he actually calls it an oligopoly. And this view, and we can talk about this, as he becomes more conservative, he changes his rhetoric, but the view itself never changes, right? Even when you read things like Nations by Consent, which is what paleo-libertarians will point to as saying, oh, look, Rothbard changed his view on immigration. It's not at all clear, and in Ethics of Liberty too, it's not at all clear that he changes his view at all. What he'll say something like, well, nation states have implemented an open borders policy, and then he'll quickly say this amounts to them giving people payments when they move from one country to another by using welfare, and this would not occur in a free market. Instead, in a free market, as long as you could find someone who is willing to rent you a place or work, give you a job even, that, like, as long as people are willing to have you, you wouldn't be stopped. And sometimes they'll say, now if you can get everyone together and all agree not to let people in, okay, I guess you can have a free market immigration restriction. But Rothbard really doesn't change his underlying view of this very much at all. Okay, so I like his property rights applications. He's a pretty cool figure in the historical revisionism he does. He palled around with left-wing revisionists like Gabriel Kolko, and a lot of his historical work is sort of in this revisionist vein as well, where he'll look at the received interpretation of a past event, and then he'll provide an interpretation about how what the state did in response made matters worse. He'll take his sort of economic theories and bring them to bear. I also like that he's not beholden to the left or the right, and he presents libertarianism as a different third way. So I'm going to read a Rothbard quote real quick, because normally Paleo-libertarians also really like Rothbard, particularly late Rothbard, when he was trying to ally himself with the right. And there are a lot of quotes there, and some of them that when we get into the bad stuff we can talk about. I don't think I'll read them because they're not as pithy as this. But early on, when Rothbard was allying himself with the left, he wrote this quote, which is not going to sound like Rothbard to most people. Libertarians of the present day are accustomed to think of socialism as the polar opposite of the libertarian creed. But this is a grave mistake, responsible for a severe ideological disorientation of libertarians in the present world. As we have seen, conservatism was the polar opposite of liberty, and socialism, while to the left of conservatism, was essentially a confused middle-of-the-road movement. It was and still is middle of the road because it tries to achieve liberal ends by the use of conservative means. Socialism, like liberalism and against conservatism, accepted the industrial system and the goals of freedom, reason, mobility, progress, higher living standards for the masses, and an end to theocracy and war. But it tried to achieve these ends by the use of incompatible conservative means, statism, central planning, communitarianism, etc. So, Rothbard, is he praising socialism here? What is going on? And we all know Rothbard later will say stuff that sounds vaguely positive about David Duke. Now, if you look at what he's actually saying, he's saying something like, he's saying something that almost predates the modern sort of language around cancel culture, and we'll talk about this when we get into stuff I don't like about Rothbard. But he clearly later on makes overtures toward the right. My point here is not that Rothbard is a pansy about socialism or something, because he's clearly not. He clearly is very, very anti-socialism. But my point is, Rothbard is willing to ally himself with the left or the right on things that they agree with him on. He doesn't see himself as belonging to the right or the left. He sees himself as a third different thing who will work with either side if it can help him free people. But he's not a creature of either, which is another good thing about him. And this is how he also will consistently present libertarianism. He presents libertarianism as coming out of American individualist anarchists, like Lysander Spooner and Benjamin Tucker, who was a socialist, and also coming out of what he calls the old right, but also coming out of certain left-wing thinkers. He basically sees himself as a classical liberal, but he sees classical liberalism as something that's been abandoned in favor of both right-wing and left-wing statism. So that's sort of his worldview, and I think it's good. I think this is a positive way to view the world. All right, let's talk now about the bad. What things don't we like about Murray Rothbard? The things we don't like about Murray Rothbard are actually some of the same things we do like about him. So starting off, he is something of a genius. He knows everything. Not everything. He knows a ton. He's read a ton. He's very well read. And because of this, because he's read this stuff and understands it, he thinks he knows a bit more than he does. And because he's so adroit, and because he's able... So one of the anecdotes I've heard multiple people tell about Rothbard is he wouldn't really edit his stuff. He would sit down and he would write it, and he would just type all day and write a ton of... He published and wrote so much stuff, and almost all of it was first drafts because he felt comfortable with it the first time. Now that is an incredibly amazing skill to have that only very, very smart people do. But it's also something you shouldn't do, because then you say dumb stuff that you shouldn't say because you didn't think it through all the way. I guess that's sort of what I'm doing with this video now. I'm not really editing it, so there's bound to be some stupid stuff in here. But Rothbard had, in my opinion, a bad habit of writing something, being sure it was right because he thought of himself as being super smart, and then not applying the same sort of critique and critical thinking to it as he should have, just being too sure of himself. So one example of this, in Man, Economy, and State, after he finishes talking about elasticity of demand, he goes on this rant about why elasticity of supply is a meaningless concept. And based on the way he decided to define elasticity of demand, it is technically true that there's nothing in the concept of elasticity of supply that is susceptible to the same sort of formalization. This is probably getting us off track. But what isn't true is that anyone who believes in elasticity of supply would attempt to find that same sort of a thing, because it's not there. It's what they mean by elasticity of supply is some things, when the price changes, the quantity supplied is going to shift more heavily than other things when the price changes. And that's a perfectly meaningful concept, even from Rothbard's sort of more narrow methodological viewpoint. I think one of the issues about Rothbard is he was just so sure of himself that he would choose to do something or believe something or say something and then wouldn't self-edit or self-correct or later on even say, oh, I'm going to revise my view on this. He sort of just forged ahead. And I think this, in a lot of ways, contributes to that sort of negative view of him. Another thing that contributes to that negative view of him is just his stubbornness and hard-headedness. Well, I think, for example, that he's correct that the sort of praxeological method that Mises would have championed and that Rothbard champions is useful. Do I think that mathematical economics is entirely useless? No. I don't think it is. And I actually think formalizing what you write, Rothbard really thinks that that's just more likely to confuse you, less likely to yield real insights than just putting it in verbal words. But philosophy proves that this wrong. So even, right, with symbolic logic and the like, so Rothbard, even with your own narrow methodology, you're hamstringing yourself with a ridiculous position here. And then by just standing it, by just defending it with everything you have, you're making yourself and the movement that you've come to represent, because you're the most popular Austrian, you're the popularizer of it, you make it look silly, and that's not good. Right, so that's one side of the hard-headedness. The other side of the hard-headedness is there's this tendency of Rothbard to either get kicked out of movements that he's part of or leave them because they're not ideologically pure enough, or because he decides he made a mistake allying himself with, a particular wing of something. So, for example, in the 60s, or before the 60s, Rothbard was vocally anti-Cold War, vocally anti-Vietnam War, and ended up getting kicked out of National Review. I'm not going to blame him for that. I think, okay, fine. He then decides to ally himself with the left. That quote we read earlier was from his magazine Left and Right, I think his inaugural article from there. And he writes a lot of positive things about the New Left, right? He praises them for their anti-war stance. He praises them very heavily for their civil rights stance and their condemnation of police violence against minorities. And he commends them for the free speech movement on Berkeley's campus, like in very strong, unambiguous terms, and makes claims about libertarianism being a left-wing movement, part of the left wing, being to the left of conservatives. And then he becomes disillusioned, and like this is the time period again where he pals around with not just Kolko. I don't know why Kolko is the only one I can think of, but like pals around with socialist, left-wing revisionist historians and has a lot in common with them. And it's a fruitful political partnership, fruitful academic sort of partnership that he's engaged in. And then he becomes disillusioned with it and leaves. And then later in his career, right, so besides that, like libertarian organizations that he's there at the founding of, like Cato, they don't part on positive terms. They go their way, separate ways, not on good terms. Like a lot of the factionism that is common within libertarianism is traceable back to Rothbard in a lot of ways. And then later in his career, so not only does he get either expelled or leaves himself from a lot of these allyships he joins, he gets into a lot of bad allyships. And he's responsible sort of for creating, inadvertently, this is after his death, but what we would call the libertarian to alt-right pipeline probably wouldn't have existed if it weren't for some poor strategic choices that Rothbard made near the end of his career. And people who called themselves paleo-libertarians wouldn't exist if it weren't for this late period Rothbard, shortly before his death, trying to ally himself with what Rothbard colloquially called hillbillies. And it was during this period that he said stuff like, well, they finally took down David Duke, in sort of this way that isn't praising anything particular David Duke said, but is, at the very least, very, oh my word, Rothbard, come on, man, please don't make such a mockery of your legacy by saying these sorts of things. Same way in the essay Nations by Consent, like I was mentioning earlier, in his desire to ally himself with right-wing populists who he thought were coming around more to the old right again, what he's always said he was in favor of. He's always liked the old right. He thinks they're coming back around to that. He thinks they're actually becoming more in favor of limited government. But he knows they're still anti-immigrant. So he has that passage in Nations by Consent where he talks about, well, in my ideal anarchist society, if people agree that, they don't want to rent to foreign people, they don't really have to, right? And you're like, come on, Rothbard, come on. Why would you... That's probably a bug, not a feature of your system, right? Like, that's not something you want people to use their rights to do. Yes, people can use their rights to do all sorts of, nasty things, right? Like, if you have a right to free speech, let's say that is actually a right, then you go around saying horrible things about Jewish people. Like, just as an example. Do I think you should be thrown in prison for that or persecuted? No. I do think you're exercising a right you have, but do I at all condone what you're doing? No. What you're doing is your use of your rights in that situation is something that should be condemned. We're getting a little bit off track here. My point is that Rothbard would throw himself into these allyships that he would think would give libertarians more power, like the early one with the left, like the later one with the right, and he'd end up getting himself burned. He'd end up not being happy with them, because he was a small part of them, and by giving them all this lip service that he'd later come to regret, at least in the case of the left, he died before we would have seen what would have happened with his burgeoning alliance with the right. His sort of, he would just throw himself into these things too hard. Like the thing I was reading before about socialism, Rothbard would probably cringe at hearing me read that, because he's not a big fan of socialism, but he did in fact say it, and there's nothing technically wrong with him. That's the theme with a lot of Rothbard's polemical writings, which are always really well written and really fun to read, and there are a lot of things in there where when you try to figure out what's wrong with them, you come away thinking maybe there's nothing technically wrong with them, but the overtures, the implicature, the reading between the lines, and you don't have to do too much reading between the lines, what you're clearly trying to imply does have problems with it, even if what you technically said, Murray, doesn't have issues with it. That's sort of the theme I get with a lot of these alliances. And then, as evidenced by the fact that he ends up leaving these places upset, it seems like a lot of the time he's not happy with with those sorts of compromises himself. He'll make the compromises, but then since he really hates compromising his views, and will then come back later and try to convince the people who he initially made overtures and sweet-sounding stuff of that they're wrong on this particular thing, then he ends up getting kicked out of those organizations. So that's, again, sort of like formal stuff, things that I have issues with Rothbard's style. Now, of course, it's hard to take issue with the style of someone who's so much more successful than you'll ever be. But I do think those are legitimate grievances and things that can rightly make us feel uncomfortable about Rothbard, at least some of the time. Okay, so what things do I take issues with him with, technically speaking? So, first off, trying to ground his ethical theory, right, his sort of ethical theory that he uses to ground his political philosophy, he tries to ground it in natural law theory, which really isn't a good fit. And it's not, he probably could, if he wanted to, sort of bridge the gap a bit better between natural law theory and his political philosophy. But he doesn't do a great job, and it's just, his theory's a better fit with Kantianism, or something like that, than with Aquinas. But Rothbard, despite being an atheist, really likes Aquinas and really wants natural law. So it's sort of a technical point that I would take issue with him on. Like I was saying before, I think he bites a lot of bullets that he doesn't need to, because he's very invested in his system being, he would say, consistent. I'm going to use the word parsimonious. He doesn't want his system to have a lot of, ad hoc exceptions. He doesn't want his ethical system to be overly complicated. He just wants it simple. And so he'll bite a lot of bullets that he probably shouldn't. So a lot of his stuff on children, it just comes across as harsh. So he doesn't think you have the right to kill children. He does think you have the right to abandon them, though, as long as you abandon them in a public place where people will find and take care of them. And he doesn't think you should be punished for that. Right? Things that most people are going to go like, oh, that's a problem. He also doesn't think, though, that you should be violent with children or punish them in physical ways. He thinks that's, he thinks that if you do that, children have a right to leave. And he thinks that runaway children should not be forced to go back to their parents. Like, he's got a lot of these really out there crazy views that are not necessary, that he can, with a little bit more critical thinking, get out of. But he doesn't want to pollute what I'm going to call almost, I hate this word, but I'm going to say simplicity. I was going to say purity, but that's not fair to him. The simplicity of his view, he doesn't want to pollute that or get rid of it. He wants to keep it incredibly simple. And so, yeah. So he's not really where Rothbard academically, in my opinion, is the strongest. Is not the philosophy, even though he does have important enough contributions in political philosophy on the libertarian end of things that Nozick has to deal with him, like I said, but that's not where he's strongest. And a lot of people are going to read something like The Ethics of Liberty and be like, yeah, clearly these are absurd conclusions, some of them at least, so why should we take you seriously? Well, like, there's clearly something wrong in your fundamentals if you're coming to these absurd conclusions, so why are you just biting the bullet instead of going back and adjusting your fundamental starting point? Like I said before, his strongest academic stuff is probably the history. I'm not in any sense a historian. I'm not familiar enough with it, but that's the sense I get, is that that's what he's best respected for. And then his economics, while it's important historically for the development of Austrianism, and it's extremely beneficial for the popularization of Austrianism and explaining the ideas in a simple way to the masses. It doesn't contribute a lot, and it pigeonholes Austrianism in a way it shouldn't be. So I mentioned, and like he'll make these really strong claims that he can't back up, like the supply elasticity example I gave before, or some of his stronger versions of his methodological claims. You should read his stuff on banking, though, and on business cycles if you haven't, because he's just got a great way of putting it and explaining it and defending the view. But again, there's nothing original. Same with his, like, the calculation, Mises and Hayek's. They both have different versions of the calculation argument, but Rothbard carrying on Mises' version of the calculation argument, he explains it wonderfully. But again, there's not very much new there. And other things I'm thinking of, just like his some of his stuff on taxation, his public finance stuff on taxation, where he'll make the claim, look, all that matters is how much money the government takes, right? That's the extent to which they're violating rights, is however much they're taking. It doesn't matter so much who they're taking it from or how they're taking it. In fact, we should probably if we're trying to minimize the harm and we're saying, all right, the government's going to take this much money no matter what, we should focus on designing it so that people are as able as possible to evade the law, right? That's his like top concern and priority with tax policy. Is concern number one, decrease the net amount of revenue. Step number two, make it obvious to people that their taxes are being taken and make it easier for them to evade them. Which, as I'm putting it now, doesn't sound so bad to me, but my point is, it's, in my view, and I think Rothbard might agree with this, but it doesn't come across clearly if he does, and I think he might reject it. It's more evil to take $100 from a poor man than it is to take $100 from a rich man. Now, let's say I believe it's possible for people to be justly rich and people to be justly poorer, relatively speaking. Right? So let's just say there's someone who has, picking random numbers, so let's say there's someone who has $1,000 and someone who has $500. You're a bigger dick for taking $100 from the person who has $500 than from the person who has $1,000. That seems relatively clear to me. I don't think you should go in and sneak in and steal $100 away from either of them, assuming they both justly have those resources. They're both entitled to them in an appropriate sort of a way. But there's something worse, all other things equal, about taking from the poor person. So if our goal is to lower taxes, the priority should be to lower taxes for people with smaller incomes first. Ideally, we'd get rid of them for everybody. But, right, I'm just saying this is a point where I would disagree with Rothbard on his prioritization and his theorizing. But yeah, I'll stop there. I hope this has been... If you're new to Rothbard and you're curious about him, I will put some links down below to things to read to start off. But I hope this has been interesting and helpful. And if you are a fan of Rothbard, or if you hate Rothbard, I hope this video gave you a reason to either like him a little bit more or to moderate your praise of him a little bit. Or to see at least why some people like myself are a little uneasy, at least, about some of his personality tics, some of his choices, and some of his more... I guess I didn't super defend my views super well and just gave you my opinion, but I hope you enjoyed this video. Have a wonderful day. If you've got